So, Brian, the floor is yours.
Awesome. So I guess some quick background, and then I'll hop in. So Brian Walsh, I finished. Gosh, when did I graduate? It seems like forever ago. I blocked it out. I'm kidding. No, I finished up this past spring in the PhD program, and professionally, I'm the head of advice and planning at SoFi. So I guess for those of you who aren't familiar with SoFi, we're a digital bank and we don't have any branches. So we do everything online. We are big into using technology to interact and influence decisions. We're also very big into social media. And I don't know how, but somehow during the course of the pandemic, they're like, hey, Brian, can you just, actually, it's like right at the start. They're like, hey, this is going to last for a few weeks. Can you like hop on your phone and do like a live stream on Twitter, once a week to like help people learn about their finances, a lot of questions. And like, it was like the jankiest setup in the world, but people kept on tuning in. So like that happened like weekly. And then it turned into bigger things like interviews with the press. We have a show on YouTube now, like just a ton of random stuff. And so that got me interested in social media. And realistically, with any research that I've done throughout the program and even outside, like just working on papers, I'm always like, if I can double dip between like nerdy research Brian and professional Brian, like the more overlap there is, I feel like that just gives me a better opportunity. So I was like, I don't know whose idea it was. I think Derek and I were just talking and we are making fun of like most of the time that like people would make fun of me at cohort. They're like, hey, you got your PhD, so you can go on YouTube and be called Dr. Money. And I'm like, yeah, okay, it pays the bills. Leave me alone. But we were making fun of social media and the advice that we see on social media and how like dangerous it is for consumers. But we realized like, hey, like there's not really much research in this. So Derek and I just decided, okay, let's do a research project on it. Let's turn it into a proposal for FPA, and we're going to turn it into an article for JFP. And that's what I'm going to share with you. I'm going to dive way more into like the general approach than I did at FPA, just because I feel like thinking through like, hey, how did we approach things? Oh, see, I never use, I always use Google Slides instead of the PowerPoint. So, okay, now we're on the right monitor. You guys can see the title screen, right? Cool. So like throughout this, like I'll talk through the research, but I also want to talk through the thought process and why we made decisions that we did, because I think that'll also help you as you're kind of going down your paths. And if there are any questions, toss them on out there. Like I am an open book. You can probably tell by what I've talked about so far, like anything is fair game. I think there's good things we did. I think there's things that we can learn from. And I think that's the case with any research. So our project is called The Age of Influencers, Risks for Consumers and Opportunities for Planners. And realistically, the purpose of this research is to, number one, like add to the existing body of research on social media and personal finances. But realistically, we wanted to answer like two questions. Why do people use social media to learn about their finances? And when they use it, does it affect how they make decisions in their personal finances? Because I think like in our perspective, like that was important to answer those two questions, because like whether or not people use it, like it's a fact. Like people use social media for their finances, but why? And who's using it? And then when they use it, like if it doesn't influence their financial decisions, like then why are all these people doing it? Like, so obviously let's figure out how it influences people's decisions. And realistically, like I broke down the presentation where it was designed for a practitioner audience. So I went and I breezed through the overview of the study. This is where I'm going to spend more time with you all, because I feel like this is something that really, really makes sense to this group. But then really focusing on, we got 5 practical implications, which is, I think, what I stress the most at FPA. And I think when you're speaking to a practitioner office or audience is the most important. And those were related to, number one, like the use of social media for personal finances. What platforms are they using? How frequently are they using them? Also, the demographics of social media users, because this is also something that's important to understand, like who is using social media to learn about their personal finances. There's all sorts of stereotypes out there, but I think it's really important to make data-driven decisions. And sometimes they align with stereotypes, sometimes they don't align with stereotypes. Either way, let's get to the truth. Then the next practical takeaway was related to the actual influence that social media plays on people making financial decisions, and then especially different types of financial decisions, because not all decisions are created equal. Then, we get into, one of the most interesting aspects of it would be the role of financial knowledge and gullibility in who uses social media and how it influences their decisions. And then lastly, I think, I kind of ended it with like a challenge to the profession and regulators that we'll kind of hit on. And I truly do believe in this. And this is why I do as much as I do on social media. Okay, so overview of the study. Like I mentioned this, like, hey, we wanted to understand why people are using social media for their personal finances and how that influences their decisions. So to get to this, we started off with like, okay, this is our understanding, like our underlying questions that we're coming into this with. And their first step in this process was looking at like what type of models and theoretical frameworks can make sense. And most of the research that I've ever done relates to financial technology, and social media is just another form of technology. So we debated a couple different theories to use as the foundation of our line of thinking and our study. We ended up using TAM, which is the Technology Acceptance Model. It is one of the older and most cited models in information systems research, which information systems research really serves as like the foundation for any sort of financial technology research. Like when we talk fintech, and I would lump social media into this, like it really is a blend of information systems research and then like personal finance research. So we use TAM, Technology Acceptance Model. Basically, that model posits that perceived benefit and perceived ease of use influence the adoption of technology. So perceived benefit is like, hey, is this going to help me? Perceived ease of use, hey, is this going to be a pain in the butt to use, or is this going to be easy to use? And the model really is as simple as that. So it can be 3 variables. I've seen it used with just 3 variables, but we had more that we wanted to investigate. So we actually extended this model to include experience using social media in general, trust in personal finance insights that they see on social media, financial knowledge, gullibility, and then we also extended it out to see how it influenced their financial decisions. So we really kind of took a pretty, basic and well-established model with TAM, and we extended it to get to what we wanted, both on the decisions as well as considering things that we're interested in, like, hey, do people who are more gullible use this more often and listen to it more? Do people who have lower knowledge use this more often and listen to it more? Things like that to really answer some interesting questions that would be not only interesting to us, but then I think also could tell a really, really compelling story. And that's one thing that I learned along the way. I think that's helped me with academic research is it's trying to figure out how we could tell a story. And I think that's one of the things that helped us get accepted to FPA. Like only 6 papers were accepted to present at FPA. And I think it's really, ours was good research, but I think it told a damn good story. So don't be afraid to think about how you could tell that story as you're doing your own research. So we established that, like research questions, we used TAM for our theoretical framework. Next thing was, like, let's be realistic, using secondary data like NFCS or, SCF or anything like that wasn't an option. The questions we wanted simply were not there. I also was just coming off my dissertation where I did primary data collection for it. So I was kind of in primary data collection mode. I had fun with it. I thought it was great because you get exactly what you want. You ask the questions exactly how you want to ask them. And I thought that was fantastic. And we're like, cool, let's do it. So we collected a little over 1,000 responses. And how, oh yeah, Donovan, question.
I just wanted to hover over the primary data collection for a moment. So I'm just, finished first summer in the program, and I've heard, some cautioning around primary data as so potentially it could be more challenging for various reasons. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your experience with that and maybe things that others should be aware of or look out for as they're kind of embarking on their research as well.
Yeah, 110%. I think primary data is a double-edged sword, depending on how strategically you go about it. And I'll go through the entire process from start to finish. We were really strategic with it, so I think it worked out very, very well. If we would have skipped a bunch of those steps, I think it would have been a complete waste of money, and it probably be like strategic in how you approach it. So we knew like, hey, we're going to use primary data. We need to collect this information. We know the theoretical framework that we want to use. We also want to think through like, okay, we have a high level understanding of like what key like constructs we're going to include in this model. Like we want to include perceived benefit. We want to include perceived ease of use. We want to include experience using social media. We want to exclude trust in social media, financial knowledge, gullibility, and how it influences decisions. So like we knew these key constructs, and then we kind of went to the drawing board and we're like, okay, we have this model. We know what we want to include in it. We're going to collect the data. Now the key is to collect the data in the right way. Otherwise it doesn't work. So what we did is we ended up kind of going through and moving on to like the literature review, quite frankly, where like this would go in like the methods section of like a paper, where we went in and we found different scales and different ways to measure these constructs. So we went in and, I mean, honestly, perceived benefit, perceived ease of use, like that's TAM all day long. Like those questions are super straightforward. Like they're in probably like tens of thousands of different papers. So we knew what we needed to do there. Like we found those questions. We knew how we wanted to operationalize those constructs. Experience. This is something where we knew how to operationalize it because quite frankly, it was included in my dissertation from another aspect of information systems research on how you measure adoption of different things. And we actually took that from the unified theory of acceptance and use of technology. So we knew the scale we wanted to use there to operationalize that construct. Financial knowledge, we took the path of least resistance, quite frankly, and we said, okay, let's use the NFCS approach. Like it works. There's no perfect way to measure financial knowledge. There's gonna be pros and cons and criticisms of any way you do it. Let's choose one that is used all across the board. So we use that one. Gullibility was probably the trickiest one, quite frankly. And I think Derek could probably attest to this. We went back and forth nonstop on gullibility. He finally found a good one that we were like, we could agree on using. And so again, we found out, hey, here's the scale, here's how, these constructs is going to be operationalized. So that was the next step. So we started step one, framework. Step two is like, we're going to collect, data. Let's look at each one to figure out how we're going to operationalize each scale. And then, all right, Shane, then before we move on to the next part.
Cool, thank you. Could you talk a little bit more about how you measured the financial knowledge? I'm curious how, what the scale is that you mentioned.
Yeah, so for financial knowledge, we had, how many questions did we have? It would be 7 questions. So we took the 7 questions from the financial knowledge questions from the 2022 NFCS. And we treated those essentially binary variables. Did you get it right or not? Like 1 was right, 0 was no, they didn't get it right. And that includes, I don't know. And then we created an aggregate score that I'll hit on how we calculated that in a minute when I start talking about the model. But we basically just took those 7 questions from the 2022 NFCS.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, so we got to the point now where like we have a conceptual framework. We're looking at here's the constructs. We have an idea based on prior research that did it in a really, really good way that we're kind of piggybacking off of what they already showed was reliable and valid for each construct. We start putting it together and we're like, okay, we know that we need to ask these questions in this way because this is where scales are coming from. We also, as we started looking at how we're going to operationalize each construct, it became clear to us that like, hey, we also need to pick our analysis method right now. Because if we don't pick our analysis method, we may also run the risk of not collecting data in the way that we need to collect it. So we went through and we decided to use PLS SEM for the analysis method, which stands for partial least squared structural equation modeling. More or less, it's a multivariate modeling technique that's like a subset of structural equation modeling that you can use to both explain and predict relationships. And I stress that because I think that's important. Nothing against like research that explains relationships. I've published research like that. I've done research like that. I just like, I've given presentations on research like that. And I always felt weird where I'm like, X is associated with Y. And I'm like, okay, cool. But I would like to be able to say that X leads to Y. And unless you do experimental design or you run an analysis method in a certain way in which can both explain and predict relationships and have that causal inference, you can't say that. And it may sound nitpicky. I just didn't like not being able to say that. So I'm like, cool, I'm gonna learn how to use PLS SEM. And I did it for my dissertation. It's actually a super cool analysis method. Super easy to use tool, Smart PLS. It was a pain in the butt to learn, but it was pretty cool. So basically like the other thing with PLS SEM, I take a step back with structural equation modeling, you essentially have two options. You have covariance based and you have PLS. And at the end of the day, both can be used. We used PLS SEM because it is better for complex models. It also can handle different type of latent constructs. So all of the constructs that we talked about, perceived benefit, perceived usefulness, experience, trust, financial knowledge, goalability, etc., all those are latent constructs. We didn't directly measure any of those constructs. Rather, we measured things that would then essentially represent those constructs. Sometimes with a latent construct, the measurable variables, they form the latent construct, which essentially means like if they form it, they cause it. They lead to it. On the other situations, sometimes measurable variables and observable variables reflect a latent construct. So essentially they kind of like show it in different ways. Now, SEM covariance based, you can't have both. PLS SEM, you can have both formative and reflective latent constructs. That's what this model has. Because, for example, like perceived benefit was reflective. Essentially, we had a handful of questions that kind of reflected what perceived benefit was to an individual. Same with perceived ease of use. Experience was formative. We asked about different usage frequencies of different social media platforms to create like an aggregate type of variable. So that needed to be formative. Financial knowledge was formative because we have 7 questions that are going to then kind of determine their overall financial knowledge. So it's like an aggregate of those 7. Same thing with adoption, things like that. So we had a mixture of both reflective and formative latent constructs. So we kind of like had to use PLS SEM, more or less. So that's kind of where we stood, was before we even started collecting the data, before we wrote the survey, before we sent it out, we need to know what's our theory, what's our conceptual framework, how are we operationalizing each construct, what analysis method are we going to do? And once we got to that point, to Donovan's question, like we're in a place where we're like, okay, cool. We're ready to collect primary data because we know exactly what we need to get. And then most importantly, we know exactly how many responses we need to get, because you could do an a priori test on it related to the sample size to find out how many responses do I need. And, it turned out, I think we needed like 600 or 700 responses at a bare minimum to have like good results. And we were like, hey, we don't know how many of these responses we get that we're gonna have to toss out because they're bad responses. So it's an extra couple $100. Let's just collect more. We'd rather do this once and do it right than have to go back and collect more responses, because that's a huge pain in the butt. So we just ended up collecting a little bit more responses than what we need. So we basically kind of took that approach. Next thing we did related to the study is we sent out the survey. We used cloud research instead of mTurk to recruit respondents. You'll eventually have to decide, do you want to use mTurk? Do you want to use, cloud research? Do you want to just distribute it to random people? I use cloud research. I have tons of data that I can cite that show why cloud research has a good data set. The simple fact of the matter is I tried setting up an mTurk account. It didn't work. I argued with Amazon support at AWS for like 2 months when I was trying to collect data for my dissertation, and I couldn't get any help, and it really, really ticked me off. So I found an alternate solution. Like you can support any of these approaches. None's better than the other, just an option. So we collected the data, and we did a kind of like a survey quality assurance testing approach, where we threw in like reverse coded questions throughout it, where we're like, hey, instead of like scale of 1 to 7 being good, we flipped it around, and whereas scale of 1 to 7 being bad, 1 question in each little bunch. We threw those in there to catch people for straight lining. We threw an attention check question in there. We discarded responses that were 2 standard deviations less than the median completion time for the survey, because that meant they're just like breezing through that darn thing. We also did a test on it that essentially looks at like, what's the probability that all of these responses would be this way? And it looks at it and it kind of says like, okay, the easiest way to say is like, there's like a 0.00001% chance that everyone's going to feel this exact same way about all these different things. So whatever, we end up discarding 43 responses. We still had a big sample size. We're like, cool, good to go. So we collected the data, and then before we ran the PLS SEM analysis, we had to run a data cleaning process. And I do that in SPSS. I don't know, what are you guys using, Stata or SAS in the program now?
It's data.
Okay. I used SPSS. All of them are same thing. There's just different way to go about it. But we conducted an analysis. We confirmed normality, linearity, homoscedasticity, multicollinearity, and common method bias. We had to do common method bias because that has been a known risk when you're collecting survey data and you're running PLS SEM. So that's one that we had to throw in there just because it's a little unique quirk. Moral of the story is, yes, if you're going to collect primary data, you need to have a deliberate approach and a deliberate strategy with it. You need to make sure that you do a quality assurance test when you get the responses, and you need to go through the data cleaning process when you get done before you do the analysis, if you want to make sure that the data you're collecting is legit. Or you could use secondary data and avoid all that crap. Completely up to you. There's a bunch of different ways to go about it. So we got to that point. Any questions on like that overview approach before I start hopping into some of the results? Cool. Quick commercial. I will throw out there, I think the PhD program at K-State's amazing. I also don't think you should expect any sort of structured classroom setting to teach you absolutely everything you know to be a good researcher. I learned how to use SPSS and do all of the model tests and I learned smart PLS by watching YouTube videos. Now, there's a lot of YouTube videos, but if you're interested in a random thing, like there's so many cool places that you could find out about it. It's just sometimes a bigger pain in the butt to learn about it, but just throwing it out there. I think it's pretty cool. All right, so we get into the results. So the first practical implication is related to like the use of social media for personal finances. Essentially, like number one, people are using social media to learn about their personal finances. About 73% of people in the sample are using social media to learn about their finances. Now, that doesn't mean that all social media platforms are created equal when it comes to personal finances. YouTube and Reddit were the platforms that were most often utilized by people when it comes to personal finances. I was a little bit surprised, quite frankly, on LinkedIn and Twitter. I would have expected that to be higher, but it wasn't. I wasn't surprised by YouTube and Reddit, but that was the first practical takeaway. So like when I was talking to practitioners, it's like, hey, like first and foremost, people are using it. Okay, time's not unlimited. So if you're gonna start posting stuff on social media, you're gonna drop knowledge on people, you know what? Play the odds. YouTube and Reddit could be great places to start. But at the same time, like that doesn't mean that this is a surefire way to be successful. So these are just examples of things that I've done over the last, I don't know, year. Like the one on the left is on YouTube, and that one has 1.2 million views. So like that, like going from like confirmation bias, it's like, oh man, Brian's study is awesome. Brian and Derek, they did so good because they said YouTube was one of the most common. Oh, I got so many views. Well, you know what? The one in the middle is on Twitter and has 3.3 million views. And the one on the right is on YouTube. It's a different boring presentation that I absolutely bombed that has 1,500 views. And I'm like calling my grandma and my mom, and I'm like, hey, can you log on to YouTube and watch this video so I don't feel so crappy about it? Like the moral of the story is like, yes, there's things that you can do as a practitioner to set yourself up for a better chance of success. That doesn't mean it's like a foolproof way. Like as long as you're trying different things on different platforms and you're aligning and learning as you go, I think you're in a good spot. But key message is people are using social media to learn about their finances. Next up would be like the demographics of people that use social media for their finances. This is one where like like most people go back and they think about it like, oh man, like young people and people who don't have any money, they're turning to social media because old people and people with money and people who make a lot of money, they have an advisor. They don't need to turn to social media. And you know, that's partially true. Like it is correct that being younger leads to using social media to learn about personal finances more. That was one of one of the strongest predictors, and that's certainly true. So definitely social media from an advisor perspective will work better on younger people. At the same time, though, the income piece turned out to be the opposite of what we expected, where actually as income increases, they use social media to learn about their personal finances more than when their income is lower. So we kind of like, that was interesting to us because on one hand, we confirmed a stereotype. On the other hand, we kind of went against the stereotype. Andrew, what's up?
So I can see where income increases, you want to use whatever resource you have to learn. Did it reach a point where then it started going the other direction, where they like use increase with rising income, but then rising income kept going, but use decrease? Does that make sense?
Yeah, like does it reach like a plateau where it kind of goes like that is what you're asking, right? Not really, no. I mean, like, so number one, we had, like, if you look at our sample, we didn't have a ton of people that made more than $300,000 a year. So like our sample skewed more towards people making, I'm looking at it now, I would say between 35 and 100 a year. We had good representation, really, really good representation in that group. We had decent representation between 100 and 300, we only had 1% of our sample over 300. So with that kind of, I guess, limitation, throwing that out there, it did not drop off once they reached a certain level of income. I guess some other things to note too, like our sample, generally speaking, the age was distributed pretty well. Like that's one of the things I always check when I look at doing collecting primary data, because you're like, who fills out surveys? And at first I was skeptical of it. But we had, like the 18 to 24 was like 9% of our sample, 25 to 34 was like 26%, 35 to 44 was 16, 45 to 54 to 18. We even had 11% people over 65. So we had pretty good distribution when it came to age, not so much on people making more than 300 of income. So from like a practical implication perspective, like for advisors, it's like, okay, if you're not using social media because you think that your target client, because you want to work with people that make a certain amount of money, like they're not using it because they make too much money, like that's probably a stereotype that we should just squash right now. Like it actually shows that as income goes up, they use social media to learn about personal finances more. So this can be a great way for you to get in front of people if that is your target demographic, where you want to work with people that make more money. Selfishly, for the company I work for, our target demographic is Henrys, high earners that aren't rich yet. And we target people between, I would say, late 20s to early 40s. So this is actually perfect for me selfishly at work, because we want people that make a lot of money, that are young, that don't have a lot of money saved up, because we're trying to hit them well before the traditional and legacy institutions go after them. So this was like the sweet spot for me selfishly. Tom, question.
Yeah, did you use any other demographic variables that you're not showing here, or control variables, things like gender or marital status or suburban versus urban?
Yeah, we used gender, occupation, education, income, and age. So like, yeah, we did like I guess I would call them like the typical like baseline like control variables. I don't know, I always hesitate saying like the typical ones, but I feel like a lot of times those will be the ones that you see. And number one, we did that because we wanted to see like, okay, if we throw them in the model as control variables, does it actually have an impact? Number two, what we want to do is we wanted to compare this to, since the questions for demographics, they were the same exact questions as the NFCS. So that way we could compare our sample to the NFCS. So that way we could see like, is this generalizable? And that's where we there wasn't any big differences across like gender, occupation, education, age, and income, or where the differences were. And then we could also, when we write the paper, it's like, okay, here's how it compares to the general population. Like it skews a little bit younger. It actually skews, a little bit higher on the income side of things. Gender was almost a 50-50 split. Occupation was pretty similar. Education was pretty similar. So we could actually say like, hey, we collected primary data. Now, how does it compare to the general population? Cool. So the next one is the next practical takeaway is like, okay, cool, Brian, people are using social media to learn about their personal finances. Why does that matter? Like, it matters because when people use social media to learn about their finances, it influences their decisions. It had the strongest coefficient, or tied for the highest coefficient of all the constructs in the model. And I guess from a side note, like we also ran tests on the model. And I don't think I put them in this presentation because I was trying not to make it super nerdy for a practitioner audience. But like we had an R squared of 0.59, which is moderate explanatory power. We had a predictive relevance of 0.21, which is moderate predictive power. So moral of the story is like, yes, this is a solid model. And what this can allow us to say is the more you use social media to learn about your finances, the more it's going to influence your financial decisions. Now, we know, like all of us in the room, we know that every financial decision is not created equal. And then also from like someone who does this as part of his job, I'm like, okay, if I know what types of decisions are influenced more by social media, then I'm going to try to post more of that content because it's going to be better. It's going to perform better. So we broke this down when we asked about influence on financial decisions. We actually broke this down into 5 questions that formed the overall influence, into how it influenced their spending, their borrowing, their debt pay down, their investing, in the insurance decisions. And what we found was, like, number one, if you look at all these, they're up and to the right, which that means that as adoption increases with social media using it to learn about finances, it has a higher influence on their financial decisions across all the different types. But the most influence it had was related to spending, debt pay down, and investing. So if I'm looking at topics that I'm going to put on social media, I'm going to focus on spending, debt pay down, and investing topics. I'm not going to put out content as frequently on insurance and borrowing. That doesn't mean I'm never going to do it, and it's never going to work. It's just, for me, I always try to play the numbers game. And I'm like, if their odds are higher that it's going to influence spending, debt pay down, investing, that's what I'm going to try to roll with. Andrew, I see you got your hand up.
Yeah, so sorry, probably dumb question. How is not currently using recording any kind of number? If they're not using it, why is that not 0?
Yeah, because what we looked at is we looked at the influence on their overall financial decisions from both the trust in it and from using social media, which we're going to hit on the trust in a minute. So it did cause some funky things like that, where quite frankly, I was like, okay, like that's not perfect data. So it is kind of one of those things where, like, yes, you would expect that to be a 1. So the fact that it's slightly higher than 1 is like, okay, there's responses where they weren't using it and they still said it slightly influenced their decisions. So yeah, that's legitimately, that's just an interesting thing that we get when it comes to getting data. I wish I had a good explanation for that other than just crap. Data's not perfect. Like, that's the funny thing, right? Like, as we're doing research projects, like we went through a pretty, like, robust process on QAing the survey responses, on cleaning the data, on designing each question based on each scale, and the data's still not going to be perfect. Like, it's like, I feel like it's one of those things where, like, man, you just wish sometimes you get these responses that you want. Maybe that's just me. All right, cool. So the next thing we want to answer is, this is really what drove the entire reason why we did this study, quite frankly, because we're like, okay, like, at the end of the day, some people are more gullible than others. Some people know more about personal finances than others. How does that come into play when it comes to using social media to learn about finances and trusting the information that they see in social media about finances? So what we found was that as gullibility increases, people trust what they see on social media more. Okay, tell me something I don't know, right? Like, I feel like that's just confirming the obvious, quite frankly. Knowledge. The less someone knows about personal finances, the more likely they're going to trust everything they see on social media more when it relates to personal finances. They're also going to use social media to learn about their finances more, and they're going to end up taking action based on what they see on social media. So for me, what this creates is a perfect storm, because we have social media where there's 0 barrier to entry for anyone, except for people that work in the financial profession. There is a crap ton of barrier to entry if you've ever worked with a compliance department or a regulator when it comes to posting on social media. So we have the people with the most expertise, the most knowledge, in which we put the highest barrier to entry on when it comes to social media. And then we have a bunch of people that don't know anything about personal finances that can say or do whatever they want. So we have a ton of information out there. Now, at the same time, we know that people who know less and are more gullible are going to follow what they see, and they're going to use social media more for personal finances. So that is a perfect opportunity for people to get taken advantage of by people who don't know what they're talking about. And this is my last practical implication as a challenge to every practitioner, every regulator, every compliance department in the industry. Like I have any influence over any of those groups. Maybe I do, maybe one person listens, is like, oh crap. But like I took these screenshots, and this was me just going on Twitter on the flight out to FPA. And it didn't take me long to find this on Twitter. We got this dude over here dropping dollar signs, how you make $10,000 a month, like overnight, how easy it is. You got this one in the middle where it's like, hey, buy a wood chipper and for 20 grand on a credit card, and it's going to generate $180,000 a year passive income. And then we got this guy over here on the right that's saying, hey, if you have 200 grand, you could sell options and you should be set for the rest of your life. Like you look at combined, these posts had over 1 million views. And again, people who are gullible, people who don't know very much, they're more likely to see this and they're more likely to take action on it. So regulators need to get out of people's way. Compliance offices need to make sure that they're going to be flexible with people in the profession, and people in the profession need to get out there and get on social media more as like a civic duty to offset this kind of crap and kind of go out with, you know, good information rather than all this stuff. So that's how I ended it at FPA, was calling out regulators and compliance and challenging practitioners. So we'll see how that goes over when we find out the voting for best paper. That could be good, that could be bad. But I believe it, so I said it. Yeah, Derek, I didn't clear that with you first, man. Oh, he's in the car, luckily.
It's all good.
He'd be like, dang it, Brian, I knew not to trust you. All right. Karam, what's your question?
So I had a very quick question, and it's probably super easy for you. How did you measure gullibility? That seems like a pretty difficult thing to measure. Is it the difference between like perceived knowledge versus actual knowledge or something like that?
Yeah, so we took the scale from some really good research. I'm gonna butcher the author's name, but Tunis did a study on it in 2020 with some other authors, and it was a scale that had, let me look it up right now. It was a 12-item scale that really, they kind of divided it in half on kind of looking at how easy it is for you to believe what someone says. And then the other half of it was related to how much information you need before you believe what someone says. So it's kind of like half and half. And it was probably the best one that we saw, because you're right. I think that's one of those ones where you're going to get, quite frankly, response bias when you're asking questions about gullibility, because who wants to say, yeah, I'm gullible? Like, so you have to kind of go a roundabout way to ask that in a way.
And I had another question, which is related to, I noticed the sign between gullibility and trust is positive, and then the one for knowledge and trust is negative. Knowledge and social media use is also negative, but then it's positive for trust and social media action. Did all of those confirm like your hypothesis going in?
Yeah, like, so basically it's like gullibility and trust. Like the more gullible you are, the more likely you are to trust information you see online about personal finances. That confirmed. Knowledge, it's like, hey, the more you know, the less likely you are to trust what you see online. And that confirmed the hypothesis. This one, it's like the more you know, the less likely you're going to be to turn to social media to learn about your finances. That confirmed the hypothesis. And then trust is like, hey, the more you trust information you see online, the more it's going to influence your actions after seeing that. And that confirmed another one hypotheses. Cool. Shane, your hand's raised.
So I lost connection for like 10 minutes earlier, so you might have already said this, but what hypotheses did you have that were proven incorrect?
Hypotheses that were incorrect. The only one actually was perceived ease of use. Our hypothesis, we had a hypothesis around that was like, hey, the higher the perceived ease of use, the more likely they are to use social media to learn about their finances. That was statistically insignificant. That was the only one that was we hypothesis that we had to reject.
Okay, that was just insignificant. It wasn't like a negative correlation or something, or
Yeah.
the opposite of what you wanted. Okay.
Yeah, and that's a pretty cool thing, quite frankly, about PLS SEM. Is like when you look at it, like if you look at this table right here, it looks just like, you know, OLS, where you see beta, standard deviation, t statistic, and p-value, and it really is the same type of thing as you're interpreting it. It's like, okay, if the p-value is greater than 0.05, it's insignificant. Beta, you know, the bigger the number, the stronger that of a predictor that is. So it really is kind of cool when once I learned PLS SEM, you read it just like you do an OLS table. And the underworkings of it are different. There's a lot of other differences, but like the results are very, very similar.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Andrew, I thought I saw your hand go up next.
So I'm curious about the the effect. Did y'all look at like taking actions such as investing in a wood chipper? You know, if people are using social media and then they're taking action based on that, because like you said, most of the folks are bad actors, and so does that make sense? Like the next step? Yeah.
Yeah. Great question, and that's something I want to do in the future. And someone asked this at FPA, and I was like, 100% agree. We did not look at like, do you say something crazy versus something good? How does that influence a decision? I would love to look at that, quite frankly, because we all know that like a lot of times when you actually give good financial insights, it's like eating vegetables, versus when you give crazy ideas that are actually really, really bad, it's like eating a candy bar. So I would assume, and I would go into it saying, hey, if you put out bad information, it's more likely to influence decisions because it's easy and it's quick, versus you put out good information, it's going to be less likely to influence because you're going to tell someone to eat their vegetables. But I don't have the data to show that. I want to do that next though, because I think that'd be sweet to look at. Cool. Donovan, I thought I saw your hand go up next. Oh, you're on mute.
Click the wrong button. So as an aside, I had a client send me an Instagram video of a guy saying when your kid turns 15, tell them to put $500 in their Roth IRA, and by the time they're 35, they'll have $276,000 in it. And I was just blown away. And my client was like, "Is this legit?" And I was like, "It's like, come on, man." To be fair to the guy, he does the calculation and in the comment, and it's 500 per month, not 500 one time. So anyways, should include that in the actual video though. So my question is related to YouTube and Reddit, and this might be just mere speculation on your part. You might not have come across anything about it, but do you think that Reddit got pumped up from the pandemic with GameStop and AMC in terms of people actually turning to it? I mean, do people today, and maybe that's actually what your data confirms, that people today are still using it. I'm just curious about the influence of the pandemic potentially on technology that people have turned to, as you know, are people going to continue turning to those resources? Not sure if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, not necessarily from this study, but both from my dissertation as well as just firsthand experience with it. Realistically, the pandemic just accelerated everything by probably 5 to 10 years, quite frankly. It pulled it forward. YouTube, Reddit, all that stuff, still popular today, still influential today. People are still using it based on this data set, as well as I could tell you from like our proprietary data at SoFi. So yeah, I think it just pulled everything forward because you didn't have any other choice in the pandemic. I mean, hell, the pandemic made me go, I don't know, popular, or at least they put me on social media. There's no way in the world that would have happened outside the pandemic. So like, I think it just pulled it forward because there's no other choice. Cool. Icar, what's up?
Yes. Yeah, just following Andrew's question. So when it comes to usefulness, the data that you collected, you just took their word for it that it was useful. Did they follow up, like far as like if they wanted to get a debt, but they wanted to build an emergency fund, they actually took action, and how do you come up with those numbers that the actual information was useful, or it was in their benefit, or how that came about?
Yeah, a good question. So, yes, we took their word for it. And that's also something I go back and forth on across anytime I do research, quite frankly. In a perfect world, we would have access to their financial data and we would combine survey with actual underlying data. So you can get their responses and then actually see what they do. I don't have any publicly shareable data related to that, and I couldn't publish on that. So we just took their word for it in this study. Essentially, all we did is we did it on a scale, like a Likert scale, from 1 to 5. 1 being not at all influential, like 5 being extremely influential. Like, how much did this influence your decisions related to spending, borrowing, debt pay down, investing, insurance? So there was 5 different questions where it was essentially self-assessed.
So within your, after this research, what's your point of view far as as an industry, do we really want to get in depth into social media, or do we still want to have that? I mean, you don't see you see lawyers, yeah, giving advice on that industry, but it's not like they're gonna go there and like taking action on it. So do we really want to water down as a financial advisor to like, hey, jump waist deep into social media because it's working? What's your view on it?
I think as a profession, we don't have a choice whether or not people are going to social media to learn about personal finances. They are. It's just a question of, do we want to be there when they're there, or do we want, I don't know, the 18-year-old kid that lives down the street from me that cuts my yard sitting there giving him financial advice rather than one of us? So they're already going to go there. We don't have any control over that. It's just a question of where they're to, or if the random people across the world are there.
All right, thanks.
Tom.
So you showed at the beginning the usage on the different platforms and how some of them had lower usage than others. Did you find anything else interesting by platform, such as influence differed by platform, or the trust differed by platform?
Yeah, so we did not break that down by platform. Basically, like, this was essentially like a sample descriptive. This was not actually included bit by bit in the model, because our dependent variable was like influence on their financial actions from social media. That was formed by the 5 kind of observed variables related to spending, debt pay down, borrowing, investing, insurance. Also, if we look at the construct related to social media use, related to learning about your personal finances, in the model, that also was one construct that was formed by their usage of YouTube, Facebook, Reddit, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So what's that? 2, 4, 6, 7. So 7 measurable variables essentially formed one latent construct in the actual model. This is more just for informational purposes, not as a part of like the predictive model. Ironically, I tried to break it up for my dissertation. I had a similar data set, and it just the analysis does not work. You truly need to have it's built in a way where you have constructs, and they need to either be reflective or formative latent constructs, and you need to have your observed variables outside of it. You can't just kind of pick it out and say, hey, instead of having this latent construct of social media use for personal finances, I'm pulling this out and I'm only putting in YouTube, and I'm going to see how the model still works. The analysis doesn't work that way.
Makes sense.
I spent probably 5 or 6 days trying to figure out how to make it work that way. And then YouTube told me, you're an idiot, Brian. Stop trying to break the model.
Because I might speculate and say LinkedIn maybe has higher quality advice and should be trusted more. But if you, I mean, who knows?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, LinkedIn is probably one of those things from a personal perspective that like baffles me, quite frankly, because like we do stuff on, I've done stuff on every platform except for TikTok. I don't use TikTok. Maybe I'm old, I don't know, the kids these days. LinkedIn, we get much less like adoption, like much less people view things, but the engagement level is significantly higher. So it all depends on what we're looking as our output metric when we're doing social media at SoFi, as far as where we go and what we're trying to get out of it. So I agree with you. Cool, we got a few minutes left. What other questions you got? Doesn't have to be about this. It could really be about anything. I just finished up the program, so
I have a question. The
Yeah.
company that you work, I've been looking at investments. Like I got Discover Bank, and they do great with CDs. I didn't know much about the company that you work for. How I mean, they're good, they're legit. Like that was one of the biggest ones. Like, how long you been working for the company? Because they got some really great interest rate right now with CDs. But I was hesitant about it because it's an online. Do they have a headquarters anywhere?
Yeah, so SoFi, I've been here 5.5 years.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm biased. You know, at the end of the day, I think we're a great company. Personally, I think we're gonna take over the financial industry in about 10, 20, 30 years. But I'm completely biased. That may or may not happen. We're legitimate. We have our bank charter and everything. We got about, actually, I can't say how many members we have because I don't remember what the publicly disclosed number is, but we have a fair amount of members or customers. We offer pretty much everything across the board. We just take a different approach. Like we don't have branches, we don't have offices, we don't have anything like that. We put our money into social media, into digital marketing, into naming rights on SoFi Stadium, into the sponsorship of the new golf league by Tiger and Rory. Like, so it's just a different approach to attract a different clientele than other institutions. Relatively similar business model though.
Okay, I was just curious because
Yeah, but yeah, I think we got like about 4.5%
on
our APY on our checking and savings. So yeah, that's solid. Not as high as a T-bill, but it's
I
solid.
would just because it comes up on top every time you look into like interest rate right now for CDs or savings. It's like the first one that comes up. So I was just trying to see if it was legit, but
Yeah, that's where we spend our money instead of physical locations. We make sure we're right up top whenever anyone searches that. All right, Shane, you got a question?
Yeah, it's about data usage. So you made that comment about the client data that you had available to use. What do you ever do research that includes actual client data that just stays within the firm? And if you do research with that data, are you ever allowed to use the findings without disclosing the actual data, like for something like FPA?
Yes, I do that internally, and no, we don't share it publicly. We go back and forth on that, quite frankly. But pretty much like we honestly working for SoFi was probably made the transition to doing the PhD program much easier because we kind of run like a research driven organization where it's basically like test and learn everything, and data should drive all of your decisions. So like if we add a new feature, you can assume that we tested it and it works or it didn't work. If we do something on social media, like we launched our Richer Live series, the YouTube show that I'm on it, like if we're paying celebrities to be on there and we're trying to get, views and everything, then we design an experiment to then test it. And we just, they do not let me share that publicly, like in research, because I feel like that'd be pretty sweet. Like that would be like layups to win best paper awards and stuff like that, having data that no one else has. So like, I feel a little bit sad about that, quite frankly.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I was just curious as far as like people that are in the private sector. Russell's brought that up a couple times with his research aspirations.
Yeah,
So
I guess
kinda
I do.
curious.
I have a follow-up question to that.
Yep.
So yeah, I work for a large investment management firm, and I have reason to believe I might be able to get the data. I'm also learning that they're very worried about the liability associated with the data. And so, yeah, I guess, is it a complete, occasionally I'll read research and I will see like, we got data from a large European bank that and it is published high quality journals. Is it a complete no-no, or I guess, is it just something that people won't take as seriously because the data is just a big question mark?
Yeah, it's very firm specific, quite frankly. Now, what's ironic is if I publish research that says the data is from an anonymous, US based fintech, they're going to go on LinkedIn and be like, oh, dude works for SoFi. You know what I'm saying? So me using it is probably different than someone externally using it. Ultimately, as a company, we made the decision that we don't share this data or allow research to be published on it unless we like publish a survey or whatever, for two reasons. Number one, because there is going to be that risk, even if you anonymize data, there's some way, somehow, a risk that it could expose private information, even if it's aggregated. I disagree with that personally, but completely valid, like safety first, whatever. The other reason would be, okay, if we are getting insights out of our data, and it helps us offer something that's slightly better in our experience, why would we go and tell our competitors? And then it helps them do something like that quicker. I also personally disagree with that because I think it would take institutions too long to do it and replicate it. But my opinion does not matter enough to override that.
Yeah. My current pitch on the last part is, financial advisors, there are hundreds of thousands of downloads on the CFP journals, FPA journals, yada, 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 that if that's your target market, or end clients, I'm sure there's an equivalent. If that's your target market, then it could be, the lemon could be worth the squeeze, but it doesn't seem like that's like you said, not everybody agrees with that.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, I've seen it work for other people. It's just, it hasn't been a battle I felt is worth fighting enough to actually fight it, more than just like sending a couple emails and asking. But I think it would be cool, because I do think like some of the coolest stuff I do from a research perspective, no one knows about because it just influences our product, which is also cool. But I'm vain. I want to see my name in journals. You know what I'm saying? Like, that'd be cool.
Yeah, agreed. Well, cool. Well, appreciate your time. This was great.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah, thanks, Brian.
Yeah, no problem. If y'all have any questions, just feel free to toss it on out there. I'm on LinkedIn. Derek's got me an email. I've just finished up the program, so I understand what you all are kind of going through. I think it's awesome. So yeah, if I can help in any way, just let me know. All right. See you guys.
Brian, I appreciate your presenting.
All right. Have a good one, Derek.
See you later.
Bye.